we're having a bunch of all of this equipment installed. It was before Brett got here to take care of it all for us, but we had some guys that came over from Calvary Baptist, and I was talking with them about it, and they said, all of because they have a huge production and lights and giant LED screens and all of that, but they're intentional in the way that they do it, and they are trying to communicate something about the glory of God and all of those things. So perhaps, maybe, the Lord actually, would have in mind us making much of the technology and the resources that we have. Who knows? Or we could spend it all on, needy people and starving families. Where is the balance? I don't know. Fortunately, this only cost us a couple dinners out to get this one accomplished. So anyway, I heard about a pipe organ that cost $150,000 at a church, and one of the parishioners there was able to just stroke the check for that one. And I thought, boy, we need a pipe organ. We'll sell it for $140,000 and do some other stuff. Anyway, welcome back. We had a week off last week. Did you guys like that presentation by Tom Beckwith? Yeah, I'm going to go have lunch with him tomorrow. We're going to debrief a little bit about that, and I'm just going to talk with him some more about his ministry and what he's been up to. But I really appreciate it. I thought it was really nice. But we're back. We're back at it here, so we are jumping back in only 15 minutes late on our start. That's fine. We're doing quite all right. I must have changed the computer, or AJ did. Can you just flip it back over for me, buddy?
There's an update.
Say no. Always say no. Never update. Never update anything. Here we go. So we will be finishing out chapter 12 today. That is the discussion about the woman and the dragon. So if you have your Bibles, we'll be in Revelation chapter 12, talking about the woman and dragon. You might remember the last week that we met here, we covered the first few verses of chapter 12, which were that sign in heaven. And John looks and he sees a sign in heaven. This another interlude section, and he saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, and a crown of 12 stars at her head, and she was about to give birth, and there was a dragon waiting there to eat the child when he was born. And we looked at some of the natural cosmological phenomena that took place that can be kind of an answer to that vision that he had, that sign that happened there back in September of 2017, which was kind of a forerunner of those two eclipses that we just had 7 years apart, and all of those weird signs that seem to be sounding some kind of alarm or pointing to some kind of thing, some kind of signs. As we talked about when we were in the study of John, that signs are not really anything in themselves. The nature of a sign is to tell you about something else. So these signs in the heavens telling us about something. The best I can make of it is the days are drawing to a close here. Somehow, whatever that's going to look like, and whether it's 100 more days or 100 more years, we're closing in on the end of human history, is my suspicion. Isn't that exciting? It's exciting, right? Because we're all going to go meet the Lord soon. That will be amazing. I was just fantasizing the other day about heaven, one of my favorite things to do. If you don't ever fantasize about heaven, you should do it. You should just clear your mind of everything else and just try to imagine what heaven's going to be. And then you'll be begging for the Lord to come. Now, come today, Lord. We remember the purpose of the whole book, to remind God's suffering people of the victory of Jesus Christ over the power of Satan. That is the message of the book. here is our very, very quick recap of the book. I won't bore you with this too much. Hopefully you remember pretty much where we're at. We got the churches, the seals, the trumpets, and then the bowls and the millennium. We're just kind of here at the trumpets. We have this kind of intermission that is taking place, which is going to take us through chapters 11, 12, and 13, and we'll have the conclusion of all of that in chapter 14. But that is where we are. And then this puts us right here in this chiastic structure that we looked at when we opened this thing up. And these kind of parallel sorts of ideas going on there. You can see them as they all step in. And as with all chiastic structures, the center point is usually the focus of whatever the particular work of literature is, and whether that's just a psalm in the book of Psalms or whether it's an entire book, you find usually the main point in the center of a chiasm. And here we have at the center of this chiasm, Satan being cast out of heaven. And that is what we are going to be looking at tonight, specifically. And basically, that is just a snapshot of the defeat of Satan, which is the purpose of the letter, to remind God's suffering people that Jesus has overcome. So Satan being cast out and being defeated is right there at the center. And we're going to look at that. Yes, it is 12, 13, and 14. I thought that it was. And then I said 11, 12, and 13, I think. But 12, 13, and 14 are this interlude section. And we have here in chapters 12 and 13 this kind of looking back. And this is from the futurist perspective here, just so you can make the distinction there. But it is a looking back at the events of the Great Tribulation. And then when we get to chapter 14, it'll be looking forward to Jesus' reign on earth. So right in the middle, there is kind of this like hinge where we kind of look back at everything that's taken place, and then we look forward, and then we start to move forward again after 14. So this brings us to this section about the war in heaven. A fascinating consideration. When I'm daydreaming about heaven, I don't ever think of a war going on there. I have thought about it briefly, tried to picture it in my mind, but we'll see what happens as we read through it. Here in Revelation chapter 12 and starting in verse 7, it says, "Then," and this is, of course, the then after he sees this sign, right? The sign of the woman. And I guess just really quickly to reiterate, that seeing that sign is actually something that points back, right? Because in that sign we can see obviously the birth of Jesus. You have the woman about to give birth, the dragon about to devour the child. We saw that with Jesus and with Herod. We're actually going to see some more tonight about the way that this story continues on, that we see in the life of Jesus and Mary and them kind of fleeing off into the wilderness to be protected. And you see that in the life of Jesus. But it is also in the life of the church. And of course, our preterists are seeing all of this happening in the first century with the church, that the church is birthed there after the ministry of Jesus. It is this fledgling baby church. And you have there this beast that is waiting to devour the child, the church, as it were, to persecute them and to snuff them out entirely, and they flee away. We're going to look at that today. And then you also, this may be in a pointer to sort of an end times phenomenon that happens where there would be a great persecution of the church in the latter days. So kind of a multiplicity, a recapitulation of these events happening long ago, and then more recently, and then maybe still in the future. Interesting to consider how the Lord does that. But a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. And then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, for the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down." And they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. So, you have this picture here, a war breaking out in heaven. The Michael, and we'll look at who Michael is here in just a second, very easily overpowering Satan. I actually have a tattoo, if you guys have ever seen them, on this arm right here. It actually is a picture of, it's from a painter in the 16th century named Guido Reni, and he paints this picture of Michael with his foot on the head of the devil, and he's binding him in chains to throw him into everlasting hell. And I just thought it was awesome. So I got it stamped on my arm forever, just as a reminder of the victory of God. And interesting, and we'll see how the whole thing plays out here, but God could give his power to anyone to overpower the devil. And really, it's interesting here because it says that they overcame, right? They, is it right here? They triumphed by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink away from death, so they actually triumphed over Satan in giving their lives unto death in the very same manner that our Lord triumphed over Satan, which was by giving his life. So you have this weird, as this is going on, there is a large kind of interplay in the time here with past sort of events and kind of contemporaneous events for John and perhaps maybe even future events. But let's see what our two different camps have to say here. The preterist, looking for a first century fulfillment of this prophecy. Most preterists do not believe that the war in heaven is chronologically subsequent to the flight of the woman into the wilderness. So again, we're kind of shifting back and forth through time. This is not necessarily a step-by-step chronology of events, but kind of more thematically being presented as opposed to chronologically. David Chilton says, St. John unveils this scene in order to explain the preceding verse to show why the woman had to flee into the wilderness. And once that is explained in verses 7 to 12, he returns to the theme of the flight of the woman. So you had the woman there, dragon's waiting to devour the child comes, but the woman and the child flee into the wilderness, and then there's another cut, and now we go up into heaven real quick. We see the dragon being cast out of heaven, and then we're going to return back to the woman here in just a minute. So it is, again, not necessarily that all of these things are a step-by-step process here, but we're looking at them thematically. So what Chilton is saying is that John is showing this scene in order to explain the previous verse, to show why the woman had to flee into the wilderness, and that is because she fled into the wilderness because Satan came down from the heavens down to the earth. When he came down to the earth, there was trouble on the earth, and the woman fled into the wilderness. That's an interpretation. Some preterists identify Michael as Jesus himself. This is not to imply, as do the Jehovah's Witnesses, that Jesus is a mere angel or a created being. Rather, as Christ has been symbolized previously as a mighty angel. And if you remember, if you go back into verse 10, we saw that, and it was a very clear picture of an angel, as it was described, that had to be Jesus in verse 10. So you have times where Jesus is portrayed just like he's portrayed as a lamb, and he's portrayed as a lion. Sometimes he's portrayed as an angel. It is a little bit different here that they actually name that angel, but we'll see here. So also here, the symbol of Christ is that of the archangel. And we have one reference of Michael being called an archangel, and that is in Jude 9. Archangel does not necessarily mean a member of a superior class of angels, but chief of the angels. And this would be similar to commander of the Lord's army in Joshua 5:13-15. If you remember that, when Joshua is there, they're getting ready to take the promised land, and he sees this man standing there, and he says, whose side are you on? Right? And then the man is like, well, actually, it's whose side are you on? And that man there is Jesus. It is a Christophany, a pre-incarnate vision of Jesus on the earth, and he introduces himself as the commander of the Lord's army, and that there is Jesus, the commander of the Lord's army. So we're seeing the same sort of title being given to Michael, who it might be Jesus here, who is actually the one casting Satan out of heaven. The fact that he is seen leading the angels of heaven as a victorious army against satanic kingdom further suggests the identification with the Lord, since Christ is seen in this same role elsewhere, and we'll see that when we get to chapter 19. Here is a quote from Philip Carrington. It makes sense of the chapter, this interpretation. Of course, if you want the book to be a Chinese puzzle, this will not weigh with you. But if you think that the author or even the final editor of the book intended this chapter to have a meaning, then you will think it reasonable to consider an interpretation of it which removes confusion. A woman who is pictured as the bride of the Lord bears a son. She is the new Eve, and therefore her son is to crush the serpent. She is the virgin of Isaiah, and therefore he is a warrior king. There follows a war with the serpent in which an opponent cast him out of heaven. The serpent then went off to make war with the rest of the seed of the woman. Clearly then, the person he had first fought with was also the seed of the woman. Why drag in anyone else? So he's saying, right, that the conflict from the very beginning, after Adam and Eve fell, and he's just God's dispensing the curses. I will put enmity, he says, to the serpent between your offspring and her offspring, between you and the seed of the woman, which we all know, of course, is Jesus, right? So what he's saying, he goes back to that first prophecy in the garden, and he says, if this is who the feud is between Jesus and between Satan, then when we see this picture of this heavenly entity, this heavenly being casting Satan out, we should presume it's Jesus, because he seems to be the one that the devil is fighting with. Now, when the devil is cast down from heaven, he begins to make war against the children of God, the earthly children of God, the offspring of the seed, so as the lineage continues. So that is an interpretation. Preterists also suggest that the angels who accompany Michael, possibly Jesus, are the apostles, together with the angelic forces that cooperate with them. We are not to conceive of this conflict as one of physical force, like Milton's battles in Paradise Lost, but rather as a moral and spiritual victory gained by truth over error, by light over darkness, by the gospel over sin and unbelief. So again, kind of turning the whole thing into a symbol or metaphor, that you have the angels, you have Jesus, and then his disciples, and that is essentially, Michael and the angels, the rest of the hosts of heaven, waging war back and forth against the powers of darkness, and not an actual physical war, although it probably wouldn't be physical if it was actually angels and demons fighting in heaven. Not a war that is taking place kind of in the sense of the clashing of entities, but it is the clashing of ideals. So a spiritual battle, much less than one of any kind of physical force. Because the great dragon was cast out as a consequence of the battle, it may be inferred that this coincides with the accomplishment of the atonement at the death and resurrection of Christ. This is the prevailing view for the preterist, that the victory that was accomplished at the cross is actually the victory that is being talked about in the book of Revelation, that it is actually Satan was defeated at the cross. And as you have heard me talk about many times in here, this idea, this theological idea of the already not yet sort of thing, that victory is already won, not yet living in the full reality of it. So it is with Jesus and with the cross, that at the cross, and then particularly at the resurrection, sin and death are defeated. Sin and death were defeated at the cross and with Jesus' resurrection. So really, the battle's over. Jesus won. It's already done. The war is over. At this point, if whatever is still going on in the earth is basically the devil throwing a temper tantrum because his days are short, which is coming here. But Jesus says this in John 12:31. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. Jesus said that on the night before he was to be crucified. This was what he said, that now in these events that are taking place in my crucifixion, the enemy is cast out. The enemy is about to be defeated in what is going to take place in the next 24 hours. So good reason to believe that there. Another evidence appears in the announcement that now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. This from verse 10 of chapter 12. This also coincides with the atonement. So you can see how this could be alluding to the atonement taking place at the cross there. In addition, other New Testament authors confirm that a victory of this sort over Satan was accomplished by Christ in his death in Colossians 2:15, Hebrews 2:14-15. I actually referenced this passage from Colossians 2, I think 2 weeks ago on Sunday morning, that Jesus, by his death, disarmed the powers of darkness. He disarmed the enemy, basically rendered him powerless and inept. So the New Testament writers do kind of draw on this idea that Jesus' death was the utter defeat of Satan. The death of Christ did not put Satan entirely out of business, but it ended his career as the accuser of our brethren. His principal role in pre-Christian times, and I referenced this also 2 weeks ago, that passage in Zechariah 3 where the priest Joshua is there and Satan is making accusation against Joshua. And then, of course, God tells him to shut up. He says, shut up. You don't get to say anything here. Shut your mouth. God rebuke you. So you have that there. The blood of Christ has undermined the grounds of every charge that Satan might bring against the brethren. This beautiful passage from Romans 8. Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is he who condemns? It is Christ who died and furthermore is also risen, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. So very good. You can see very obviously the tie there, the connection between Satan's defeat and Christ's death. So Satan is cast out of heaven to earth. He cannot accuse the saints before God any longer, for they overcame his accusations by appeal to the atoning blood of the Lamb. They also take territory from the satanic kingdom by the word of their testimony, that is, by preaching the gospel, and by their willingness to die rather than be intimidated by persecution. So the victory then extended to all believers, and of course you know that song, we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb, word of our testimony. You guys know that one? Everyone. We should do that one soon. It's really good. And that is how they overcame, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And I love that it says, and they did not shrink away from death. It reminds me of the words from 1 John chapter 4, I think. And he says, dear children, let us walk in obedience so that when the Lord returns, we don't shrink away from his coming. that we're living in such a way that if Jesus were to show up, we would have nothing to be ashamed of and we could just run to him. And in the same way, this is what he's saying. They loved Jesus and understood what he did for them so much that they ran towards their deaths. They were not afraid of dying. They greeted death. And then a woe is proclaimed upon the inhabitants of the earth, since the dragon is now limited in his range of activity and will vent his wrath both upon the saints and upon apostate Jews. His intention is to stamp out the church before it can extend itself as a global entity. He failed. Since Jesus indicated that this would be accomplished within a single generation, right? We have that in the Olivet Discourse there in Matthew. The dragon has only a short time to stamp out the infant movement. Thus, he goes to war with the remaining seed of the woman. So basically, devil's cast out, and he's really, really upset. So he starts going to town against God's people. And again, this is both true believing Christians and apostate Israel, unbelieving Israel. Even though they don't believe, he hates them all the same because they are God's chosen people. And Stuart Russell says, translating the symbols into common language, they appear to signify that the progress of Christianity in the land aroused the hostility of Satan and his emissaries and led to more active persecution of the disciples of Christ. So this defeat of Satan, that being Jesus at the cross, made Satan really mad, and he started working overtime. That the first century interpretation. Now for the futurist interpretation, looking forward, the scene shifts unexpectedly from earth to heaven. At some point in connection with the events of the previous verses, war broke out in heaven. So futurists, again, seeing this weird kind of, who knows exactly what's going on here, but we saw the sign in heaven and the woman's having a child, and they're fleeing, and now there's a war in heaven, the devil's being cast out. Kind of curious how all of these things happen, but that is between God's angels and the forces of Satan. The angels are seen as under the command of Michael, the only angel in Scripture that is called the archangel, again, Jude 9, and who is first introduced in Daniel. And this from John Wolverd. The event here prophesied was predicted by Daniel, the prophet, in Daniel 12:1, where it is recorded that Michael shall stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. This event marks the beginning of the great tribulation defined in Daniel 12:1. It is undoubtedly the same event as in Revelation 12. So he is seeing this prophecy, and if you remember, we looked at this bit from Daniel because it has to do with Daniel's 70th week. And that 70th week, if you were here when we went through that excursus about the 70th week, it is the last 7 years, essentially, of the earth. This is where we get the 7-year tribulation from. There was a pause put on that timer in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple because that timer has to do with the temple. It is specifically about the temple. It is specifically about the edict that is given by Cyrus, who tells the Jews that they can go out of captivity and rebuild the temple. And when they rebuild the temple, the timer starts. When the temple is destroyed, the timer's paused until presumably another temple is built, at which point the timer continues. It turns back on, and we have 7 years. And what he's saying is, in Daniel, you get a description basically of this scene, so that John is kind of looking to Daniel here and to this vision in order to describe what's going on. So this would be then at the midway point of the 7 years when the Antichrist, who presumably in the futurist sort of timeline is the one who comes in on the white horse and kind of takes control of the earth through some kind of political / religious system, takes control of the earth, confirms a covenant with the nation of Israel. They rebuild the temple, and then somewhere in the middle of that, right in the middle mark, he breaks that covenant, with Israel, and this is when the Great Tribulation period starts. And this is the outpouring of the wrath of God on the earth, as well as the continued fury of the dragon, the beast, the Antichrist against the people of God. So from the futurist perspective, we are looking now to the last 3.5 years, the last horrible 3.5 years here on earth. The warfare in heaven brings the unhappy result of Satan and his angels being cast out of heaven and confined to earth. This event occurs in the middle of the tribulation, or the beginning of what is called the Great Tribulation. John Wolverd. Though the events of the chapter deal in general with the end of the age, it is clear that they do not come chronologically after the seventh trumpet. Rather, the fall of Satan may be predated to the time of the seal in chapter 6, or even before the first seal. His fall begins the Great Tribulation. So again, this is not talking about, this is chronologically the moment of the fall, but this is just a time in the vision when John is looking and he's seeing, oh yeah, Satan was cast out of heaven at one point. And the futurists are saying that happened back, if you remember, back in chapter 6, when the star falls out of heaven and then it opens up the pit, and then all of these demons and all of this stuff come out. So all that to say, it's not chronological. Just hold that in your minds. Not chronological here. Satan is cast out into the earth, and his angels are cast out with him. It is identical with what we have seen already under the fifth trumpet, the star fallen out of heaven, opening the pit of the abyss with the darkening smoke and the locust swarms coming forth. So there you have it. It's just a retelling of something we have already seen here. A voice in heaven declares the significance of Satan's defeat. Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. Charles Ryrie says, at this defeat of Satan, which probably occurs in the middle point of the tribulation, a voice in heaven breaks into praise. It announces salvation and the kingdom, since one more major conquest has been made in the march toward inevitable victory for Christ. The salvation mentioned as now impending refers not to salvation from the guilt of sin, but to salvation in the sense of deliverance and completion of the divine program. Though salvation and power have come, and though Satan has been defeated in the heavenlies, the fighting is not over. As the accuser of our brethren, Satan can no longer stand in heaven, but he continues his attack against the tribulation saints on earth. They are ready for him. However, they stand their spiritual ground and even overcome their attacker by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. The accusations of Satan are nullified by the blood of the Lamb, which renders the belief pure and the believer pure and makes possible his spiritual victory. The word of the saints' testimony opposes the deceiving work of Satan. So, again, the power is being drawn from the cross, but the futurists are actually seeing this as an actual war breaking out in heaven. Not symbolically like the preterists are taking it, but they're actually seeing that in these latter days that Satan is still going to and fro from the heavens into the earth, and it is at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation that the Lord says, you don't get to come here anymore. You're done. Stop coming up here and bothering me. You're done. You come back here no more. And this is the essentially defeat of the enemy. He's being cast down to earth where he is about to be judged before he's judged, tormenting everybody on his way out. So that's the difference there between those two perspectives. This victory of the saints over their accuser is entirely spiritual. Physically, it is he who seems to prevail. The winners are those who keep their faith intact until they die, who do not love their lives until death. So again, well, maybe not again, but the defeat of Satan, literal, cast out from heaven, but the victory of the saints, not a victory in which we're actually overpowering the devil here in this earth, but the victory in which we have been saved and we are actually winning through our death. if that makes sense. Think that's easy enough to follow. Satan will vent his wrath against the inhabitants of the earth and the sea because he knows that he has a short time. And again, there you have the earth and the sea, and that being the nation of Israel and all of the Gentiles, all of the peoples of the world. The short time or season, Greek word kairos there, which is it is a time, it means time, but it is like a season of time, refers to the time of the Great Tribulation, after which Satan will be bound for the duration of the millennial kingdom. And we'll get to that when we get to that. But he's going to throw a tantrum, and then he's going to get bound. That's what the tattoo actually is, of him getting chained up. So this brings us to the last portion here of chapter 12, and this is the woman being preserved. So it says in chapter 12 and verses 13 and 14, when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. That, of course, is 3.5 years there, time, times, and half a time. 3.5 years. And then from his mouth, the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So you can see here that everything that is being told is this is the turning point here in this whole thing where the beast is making war against the people of God, that he has set his eyes now on the people of God and he is bent on their destruction, a real holocaust of sorts. You can well understand why many people back in the 30s and 40s, seeing what was going on with the Jews and the attempted eradication of the Jews, were thinking, is this happening right now? Is this what's going on? Because they were rounding up all of the people of God and trying to kill them, and presumably, it's gonna happen again. So the woman, it is said, she flees into the wilderness where she will be taken care of for time, times, and half a time. And I had mentioned 2 weeks ago, the last time we met, that a lot of people believe that this is Petra. If you guys are not familiar with Petra, if you have ever heard of Petra, it is a place in Jordan. Petra is a Greek word for rock. That is what it means. And this is a city, well, not a whole city, but it is basically I don't know how many people could inhabit it, but it's carved out of a rock there, as you can see. This is kind of actually a little more common than you might think, that they carved buildings and churches out of the side of mountains. And here you just have kind of the edifice there, and of course it goes in and you have various rooms. No one is entirely sure where it came from or when it got there. They date it at the earliest to somewhere around 700 BC, so 700 years somewhere before the time of Christ, and then up to, I think, at the earliest, somewhere around 300 BC, so somewhere in that area this was made. And this was the area of Edom, and it was the Edomites who were out there, and there was, this is a wilderness. There's nothing out in this area except for this, and they believe that there were some Bedouins who were out in that area and some traveling merchants and things like this, and this may have originally been constructed as some kind of a, an ancient, one of those gas stations out on a highway, in the middle of the desert kind of thing. Yeah, yeah, an old Wawa. Step in, come on in, get some refreshment, take a load off, that kind of thing, that there's a trade route that goes through here, and this was perhaps there for them. So this, still there today, as you can see, that those are very recent pictures. And just to give you an idea of where this is, if you can see here, that whole yellow area is Jordan, modern-day Jordan, which shares a border, almost that entire eastern border there with Israel. And you have the Dead Sea right there, which of course is connected by the Jordan River up to the Sea of Galilee in the north. So down, you kind of go all the way down almost to the southernmost point of Israel, and then you just jump over into Jordan, and there it is. So you can see that a literal kind of fleeing of people from Israel down to Petra is well within the realm of possibility. I forget how the distance, like from Jerusalem down to here, but it's a couple 100 miles, I think, at the very most. So you could easily walk it in, several days, however long it would take. I don't even know if it's a couple 100 miles. I think Israel is like the size of Maine or something like that. It's tiny. 100 miles. Thanks, Jim. It probably. Is there a, yeah, there it is. 100 miles. Yep. Yep, about 100. It might be 200 tip to tip there, but probably from about the Jerusalem area down to Petra, probably shy of 100. So anyway, very close. You could actually walk there. What's that?
You can walk there in 3 days from the smack dab in the center of Israel.
3 days. There you go. 3 days. Why wonder when you can just ask Google? So preterist commentators have traditionally seen this passage in terms of the escape of Judean church from the Edomite and Roman invasion during the Jewish war, when, in obedience to Christ's commands, again in the Olivet Discourse, the Christians escaped to shelter in the caves of the desert. So Jesus told them this: when all of these things happen and all of the city's about to fall, get out of here. And they did. In the earlier narrative of the chapter, Satan has always been the dragon, but now, having been cast down to earth, he is referred to as the serpent. This is interesting and kind of telling. The devil, says David S. Clark, is represented as a crawling serpent, but the church is flying on wings. You have a contrast there, the serpent crawling around on its belly, and then, of course, the dragon. And it's, when you hear dragon, we have an idea of what a dragon is, but in some regard, most of the ways that dragons are depicted, they are serpent-like creatures. They just have legs, right? They kind of look like they might be snakes, but they have legs. And when you go back to the garden, the serpent originally had legs, right? And then he was cursed, or we don't necessarily know if it was legs, but it might have been wings. There are actually seraphim. When you hear seraphim, which is a name for angels, but it actually is one that can refer to serpents. And seraphim could be kind of these angelic serpent-like beings that which, we see. Serpents aren't inherently evil. We see them and think of evil things. The serpent was cursed in the garden, but also, we're commanded to be like serpents, aren't we? Jesus tells us to be as shrewd as a serpent, be as crafty as a serpent and as gentle as a dove. So they're not inherently evil, but they have they've been associated with evil from the very beginning. But a dragon, of course, having power and being able to move and being much more intimidating, now being cast down to earth, essentially having its legs taken to crawl around in the dirt on its belly, and now being referred to not as a dragon, but as a serpent. That's pretty interesting. And then, of course, the church flying on wings. The wings of a great eagle, which carry the woman to safety, are an echo of the Exodus, in which God told Israel that he had carried them out of Egypt on eagle's wings. You can read that in Exodus 19. like the woman in this vision, Israel had been delivered from the dragon and sustained by God in the wilderness. So you can see a corollary there, of course, of the Exodus and God having done this before, delivering his people from an oppressive force by carrying them out into the wilderness. History repeating itself. In an attempt to destroy the woman, the serpent sent a flood out of his mouth, hoping she might thus be carried away by the flood. This is a general reference to the devil's campaigns against the church, so lots of symbolism going on here. Almost certainly not a real serpent spewing water out of its mouth, creating rivers. There's some kind of symbol going on here. This seems to be a symbol of some kind of campaign of the devil against the people of God. This from Austin Farrer. The woman is treated as the congregation of Israel, saved from Egypt, lifted by the Lord on eagle's pinions, and brought to Sinai. The dragon's pursuit of her by throwing a water flood after her is a generalized image of the action of Pharaoh, who, 1, commands Israelite children, and especially Moses, to be washed down the Nile. 2, comes out after escaping Israel with a host, and 3, counts on the Red Sea to shut Israel in. So there you go. More Old Testament imagery kind of being seen as a fulfillment of this here, typologically, I guess you could say, more than literally. Satan's attempt to destroy the church was as faulty as was Pharaoh's scheme against Israel, for the earth or land opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood. David Chilton says this about that portion: the church is divinely protected and preserved through all her tribulations. No matter what the dragon does in his attempt to destroy the church, even bringing about the Jewish revolt, causing the Edomites and the Romans to slaughter the inhabitants of Israel, the church escapes his power. By the time Rome attacks, the woman is long gone. The land of Israel swallows up the river of wrath, absorbing the blow in her place. So again, if the land is a symbol of Israel, and it says that the devil spewed out this river to overtake the people, and it says the land swallowed up the river, then they're taking this as an interpretation that the wrath of the enemy was absorbed in the nation of Israel. That while Israel, apostate Israel, the land is being destroyed, God's faithful are fleeing, and they are being preserved as Israel is being destroyed. The great thought in all these images is that divine power is put forth to deliver and sustain the New Testament church of God in the day of her persecution. The same power that of old wrought the miracles of Egypt and of the Red Sea and of the wilderness. So again, more connections to the Exodus. The escape of the Jewish Christians from the Holocaust did not make the devil give up on his warfare and admit defeat. He continued his attack against not only the woman, the Jewish church, but also the rest of her offspring. This must refer to the Gentiles brought into God's family through the Jewish remnant church. So, warfare against God's people. And this is essentially more of the same. So for sake of time, I'm skipping that one. And this from the futurist, as we land the plane. Having read of the heavenly defeat of Satan and his being cast to earth in verses 7 to 12, John returns to the woman in the wilderness where he left her in verse 6. So again, woman, heavenly scene, coming back down to the woman. Verse 14 simply repeats the information of verse 6, adding only a few details like the fact that her flight was made possible by 2 wings of a great eagle. Such imagery was used in Exodus 19:4 and Deuteronomy 32 to describe God's care of Israel in bringing her out of Egypt and protecting her in the wilderness of Sinai. So you actually, in this image here, you're seeing, we were talking about that chiasm, and you have the woman, right, the scene with the woman, and then there's this cut scene up into heaven, and then you return back to the woman. So you can see this is the peak of the chiasm here, Satan being cast out of heaven. The woman and her child escaping into the wilderness, Satan's cast out. Now we're going back to talking about the woman and her child escaping into the wilderness. So you see, it's very nicely defined right here in this section. The woman's flight in this section may, in part, reflect the escape of the Palestinian church to Pella in 66 AD. The intent of the verse, however, is not so much the flight of the church as the provision of God for her sustenance. The passage demonstrates that God will provide to those facing martyrdom a place of spiritual refuge and enablement to stand against Satan. So God, no matter what is going on and no matter the persecution that is coming, he is giving provision to his people. There is always provision for the people of God. And that's the promise that we see here. As for the flood, verse 15, of water spewed from the dragon's mouth and the opening of the earth to help the woman, it could be a literal flood of water intended to drown people out of their wilderness refuge, possibly, but probably not. The flood of water may represent false teachings in contrast with the water of life given by Jesus. Ironside says it like this: we may get the idea of this if we recall the fact that today myriads of Jews are being carried away by the satanic flood from the mouth of the dragon known as Christian Science. So, in the days of the Great Tribulation, Satan will try to swamp and destroy Israel as a nation by the evil teachings he will spread through the world. So, that seems to be a reasonable symbolic interpretation of this, that the water being spewed from the mouth of a serpent is some kind of false teaching to carry people away, in contrast with the life-giving water that comes from Jesus. Others understand the flood to represent the overflowing horde of men and weapons sent after the Jews in the wilderness by the beast. These attackers, however, will be thwarted by an actual chasm opening in the earth and swallowing them up. That one sounds cool. You have an entire army and a legion of people going after, chasing the Jews out there to Petra, wanting to chase after them and kill them, just like happened in the Exodus. And in the Exodus, of course, God drowned them all in water, and perhaps it is this time the earth opens up and just swallows them all. Maybe. There will be other agencies in the earth by which this satanic attempt will be frustrated. These agencies will probably be those nations who have believed the final message, the gospel of the kingdom. So it may also just be that, there are other nations that fight against the beast system in the Antichrist. That could be what is going on. Wolford says it is more plausible that this passage should be understood in a symbolic way. The flood cast after Israel is the total effort of Satan to exterminate the nation, and the resistance of the earth is the natural difficulty in executing such a massive program. The nature of the terrain in the Middle East, including many areas not heavily populated, provides countless places of refuge for a fleeing people. That is true, and we actually saw this as the good guys, if you remember, back after the events of September 11th, and we were trying to chase these guys down and kill them, and they just were like, well, you get out into the wilderness, and there are just all these places, all these caves, all these little places that they could be hiding, and it was, up to our boys to go and to drive and cave by cave by cave, go and try to find them all and exterminate them, and an incredibly challenging task. So it may be that. Maybe that's what it is. But he will be frustrated in his effort. And in so being, Satan turns his special wrath against the rest of her offspring, those Jews who keep the commands of God and have testimony of Jesus Christ. This gives us some idea of the reason that dispensationalists refer to the Great Tribulation as the time of Jacob's trouble. And this is the where a lot of dispensationalists get the idea that if you're got your fingers crossed, you're hoping for and believing for a pre-tribulation rapture of the church, that the Christians are caught up and taken away, that means that the Antichrist, the beast, the dragon, is primarily then concerned with taking out his wrath against the nation of Israel. And of course, for the dispensationalist, the dispensationalist believes that the tribulation period, the 7-year tribulation, is the time for Israel to be brought into faith. That Israel has currently, as it stands right now, denies Jesus, rejects Jesus, but God has a plan for the nation as a whole to bring them into saving faith. And that is what the last 7 years of the earth's history are. That God, all of the believers were in good standing with God, and when the clock is up and time's here, God says, everybody who's with me, come on up, and we all go. But I made a promise to this people, to the nation of Israel. I made a covenant with them, and I'm going to make good on my covenant. And just like God has done in the past with the nation of Israel, and just like he does with everybody, sometimes the only way to get your attention is to send judgment. So God sends judgment. He allows judgment to happen, but the judgment is specifically for the nation of Israel, which is why it is referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. And Jacob is, of course, the one who God gave Jacob the new name, Israel. So Israel and Jacob are synonymous. So when you call the tribulation, the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble, you could just as easily call it the time of Israel's trouble. And for the futurists, who also happen to be dispensational, that is how, and if you're following with all the terminology and you remember all of this stuff, they would be the ones who would say, yes, that makes sense. All of the believing Christians are gone, and it is just the nation of Israel now who is here as God is working out his plan to redeem them and to bring them into the kingdom. And there will be a great awakening and a revival in the nation, and they will come to faith, and God will save his people, the whole nation, and bring them to himself. So that's what's going on here. And then, yes, from this point forward, lots of devil getting mad and making people put marks on their heads and things like that, all kinds of crazy stuff. So let's pray, unless there's just anyone dying to say something, but I think we're all tired out. God, we thank you for your love for us, God, your care for us, your provision for us, even when it seems like the walls are closing in all around us, God, and when we've got our backs to the sea and an enemy closing in on us, God, you always have a means of deliverance, God. You always have a way of escape for us. And I pray, God, that we rest in the fact that you have each one of us in the palm of your hand. God, that you will never leave us and you will never forsake us. And no matter what the future holds, God, no matter where history takes us, and no matter how things start to unfold here in the coming months and years and maybe decades and however much time we have left, God, that we would just keep our eyes continually fixed on you, trusting in you, God, believing in you, and that you would keep all of us steadfastly in faith and obedience to you. Go with each one from here, God. Encourage us and inspire us and uplift us by your Spirit. And we ask it all in your name. Amen.